Jeremy, much is made of the Sunni-Shia divide in the Middle East. Is that a reality, or is it just being talked up for whatever reason?
Oh, no, it is a reality. I mean, there is an historical divide between Sunni and Shia, the kind of ideological differences, historical differences, all going back to the very early years of Islam. But by and large, Sunni and Shia have lived in relative amity across the Middle East up to the 20th century. And unfortunately what we're seeing now is the exploitation of sectarianism. And this kind of ties in with Western policies very much, because from the 19th century onwards, they were playing the game of minority politics, looking for groups that they could exploit in their own interests. Mainly they were Christian groups in Lebanon and elsewhere. But they were looking for footholds, kind of where they could use the claims of these groups to kind of pursue their own interests in the Middle East, use those groups as a platform to demand something of a particular government, that you're treating these groups terribly, and if you don't do that, we'll do this. This is an old game, and that's taken a new turn with the exploitation of these sectarian divisions. And we know that, as I said, that Sunni and Shia lived in relative harmony across the Middle East, and so did the Christians and the Muslims generally. And these weren't an issue, particularly in Syria. I mean, I don't think the Syrian people ever thought of themselves as Sunni, Shia, Alawi, Christian, or whatever. All of a sudden, these divisions have been imposed upon them from the outside, and the same game has been played in Iraq. And I think this very much goes back to, in the short term, to probably about 2005, 2006. And I think the main actor here was Saudi Arabia. It was the Gulf states were kind of playing the game, but it was fun. The main actor was Saudi Arabia. And from what we have learned, the Saudis more or less said to the Americans, look, we've done everything we can to break down this Shia kind of crescent across the Middle East of Iran, Syria and Hezbollah, but nothing's worked. So what we should do is use the sectarian weapon against them, and more or less use Sunni radicalism against what they regarded as Shia ideological fervour. And I think the Americans come on board with that. And so what we've seen happening increasingly in Iraq, this tremendous kind of wave of assaults on the Shia population, and also kind of counterattacks on the Sunni population. We're also seeing the same thing in Pakistan, because a lot of Gulf money has gone to Pakistan, and there the Shia population is 20% of the overall population, and there were no such attacks until recent years. Now we're seeing kind of the same kind of attacks on the Shia Muslims of Pakistan that we're seeing in Iraq and we're seeing in Syria. So I think that the outside governments in the Gulf and in the West are using sectarianism as a weapon. I mean, these differences are on the surface, but unfortunately there are people in the Middle East who are very susceptible to being stirred up on that basis. Divide and rule. It's a very old principle, and unfortunately it's working.
My understanding is that the Syrian government is composed mainly of Sunni ministers. Would that be true? I don't know what the percentages are, but of course there are Sunni senior figures, the Christian figures in the Syrian government. We've had this propaganda going on for decades about the Alawi regime. Well, Hafez al-Assad and his son Bashar know the game in Syria. They know their own country, and what they have done over a long period of time is to co-opt and to bring in, and to share. And so you'll find key positions in the government, in the army, held by Sunnis, held by Christians. So the notion of an Alawi regime, which is the catch cry of the government's enemies, has a false basis, And one can continue developing that argument by saying, for example, what's been happening in the last 2 or 3 years. The media narrative has been based very much on the figure of Bashar al-Assad, Bashar the tyrant, Bashar the dictator, the Alawi regime, Assad loyalists, so forth and so on, and this kind of supposed Sunni Alawi split. And we know, for example, that Bashar al-Assad himself, even 2 or 3 years ago, is very popular, has a strong base of popularity amongst his own people. And the enemies of Syria they won't acknowledge it, but that in fact, that is true. And we know that the Syrian army, is the foot soldiers, fundamentally are Sunni Muslims. Right? So if they have such detestation of the government, why are they still in the army? Why haven't they run away? Why haven't they joined the armed groups? In fact, there have been very, very few defections from the Syrian army since the beginning, some very kind of high-profile ones, and I have no doubt that Qatar or Saudi Arabia paid a lot of money to win these people over, but there have not been the kind of mass defections we were being told about 3 years ago. It just didn't happen. It wasn't true, So the government is held together, the army is held together, right? And this gives the lie to the claims being made about the Syrian government
right? And the nature of the government and the nature of the army, and this kind of supposed kind of Alawi government, the country in the hands of a small circle of Alawi people who are, brutalising and telling everyone else what to do. It simply isn't true. It's a caricature. It's a caricature, and Bashar and his son are very aware of what they have had to do, to be inclusive and to bring in and to share out. They've done that, yeah.
So what's happening to some extent is you've got Sunni jihadists being enticed to Syria to kill fellow Sunnis.
Well, of course, and once again we had to go back to the media narrative. The story the media spun from the beginning, that this was a peaceful protest movement. It was peaceful for a long, long time, and all of a sudden, it was the army that kind of turned it into a violent movement. In fact, there was violence right from the start. When the protests began in Daraa, close to the Jordanian border, there were attacks on government buildings, a lot of killing, and there were killings very early in this movement. So, of course, there was a peaceful protest movement, but it was taken over. And I don't know how much this was orchestrated from outside, but I think it's certainly very true that these outside governments that have been seeking to destabilise Syria for a very long time were waiting for their opportunity and saw their opportunity, in kind of unhappiness with the fact that Syria's had an authoritarian regime for 40 years and people started to protest against it, and this is something they could turn to their own advantage. There's nothing unusual about this. We've seen this scenario being played out in many other parts of the world, in Latin America in particular. We saw it happen in Chile. You've seen it happen in many, many countries. You just dive in and you work on this discontent to pursue your own objectives. All right. So and then we were also told that the Islamist groups were kind of their domination of the scene is also fairly recent. Well, that's not true, because the Islamist fighters, I think they're coming across from Iraq from a very early period. They're crossing into Syria from Lebanon from a very early period, maybe from the beginning, but very close to the beginning anyway. And if you look at the spectrum of the armed groups, all the dominant armed groups, not just Jabhat al-Nusra, are in fact Islamist. And this includes the main brigades inside the Free Syrian Army, the so-called Free Syrian Army, like the Farouk Brigade. They have an Islamist agenda, and that's been true for the last 2 years. So this position that we've now been told that many fighters are laying down their arms and accepting the amnesty being offered by the Syrian government because all of a sudden they discovered that their revolution has been taken over the Islamists is a lot of nonsense. They're laying down their arms because they're being defeated, and they themselves, mostly by and large, have been part of these groups. But they're giving up because what is the future for them? They're not getting the support from outside they wanted. They're not getting the weapons they wanted, the big weapons that might enable them to kind of fight on longer. So what does the future hold? What are they fighting for? So I think we've had to deal with a lot of propaganda, tremendous propaganda on these points, and what we have seen is an increasing number of jihadis coming into Syria from all over the world. Last time I saw the figure, they were coming from something like 23, 24 countries. They come from all across North Africa. They come from Pakistan. They're coming from Chechnya. They come from everywhere. So Syria's become kind of jihad central. And these people are not committed to Syria in any way. They wanted to create an Islamic state at the centre of the Middle East, and they've had the support of outside governments to do that.